Hello, my name is Jonathan Plucker, a professor in the School of Education and director of the school's education policy program. I've been studying and working in education policy for about 3 decades now, and I'm really excited to be here with you today to share some insights about the impact of the upcoming elections and where we think education policy is heading. This election season has been like no other, from candidate changes to major national and international events, disasters, everything, to deepfake videos. It has been many things, but we can all agree it has not been boring. One question we often hear within the School of Ed is how the election results will influence education policy. During today's session, I'm going to explore this topic with two recent graduates of the Hopkins Education Policy Program who are both working to create positive policy change. Before I introduce my colleagues, however, I want to note that our focus today is on a state and local education policy rather than federal policy. That was at my urging, so you can blame me, in part because education, up to a few days ago, hadn't been mentioned at all in all the various federal races, especially by the two major party candidates. Of course, as we're taping this in early October, in the last 48 hours, both candidates have talked about education. So, say la vie. But I still think that a focus on the state level is very important, given that K 12 education is primarily a state responsibility, and states take it very, very seriously. If for no other reason than the fact that the biggest line item in almost every state budget is education. I believe in most states, um, the budget line for K-12 education alone is the biggest line item. If you add higher education in, it is almost always the biggest line item. So we have a lot invested in this at that state level. And in several states, the results of next month's election are going to have significant repercussions for what those states do in K 12 education policy. Helping me explore several of these examples today are Sabrina Solaris Hand and Jenny Murnane Butcher. Sabrina is a senior managing director for ILO Group. Her K 12 consulting experience centers around school transformation, secondary redesign, industry aligned education, ed tech, and capital improvement. Prior to joining ILO, Sabrina served as the chief operating officer and senior advisor to the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island. Her diverse portfolio included capital improvement, minority and women business enterprise support, GIS mapping, broadband, and cybersecurity initiatives, to name just a few. Sabrina is a first generation college graduate with a master's in education policy from Johns Hopkins. Sabrina is a lifelong resident of Rhode Island, where her son attends public school. Jenny is the program officer at the Montana Board of Public Education, supporting the board and managing the state's public charter school program. Previously, she worked as deputy director for Montanans Organized for Education, a grassroots nonprofit connecting parents and community members with the education policy process. She began her career as a Title I and fifth grade teacher in East Helena, Montana. She graduated from the Hopkins Education Policy Master's Program this August. Sabrina and Jenny, thank you for being here and having this conversation with me today.
Thanks for having us.
You.
I thought we'd start by sharing thoughts about a state that we're each focused on. That's going where this next election is going to have some important implications. Sabrina, let's start with you. What states caught your attention during this election season?
Sure. I Ohio has caught my attention, as I think it has a lot of people for lots of different reasons, but I think primarily because it's where our Republican vice president candidate is from. And so, if Ohio wasn't on the map for people before, I think it's on the map now. But what is interesting is we are talking about local education policy in states, and Dr. Plucker, you appropriately mentioned that a lot of funding and decision making is held at the state level versus at the federal level in this particular case. regardless of the fact that we have had a more left-leaning federal administration for the last few years, the red state of Ohio, for the most part, some people would call it purple, but the red state of Ohio has been making some policy decisions that are very leaning towards the more conservative side of things. For instance, they merged their Department of Education with their Department of Workforce, which is an extraordinary large bureaucratic shift that really demonstrates the state's rather focus on career aligned education for K through 12. That is a statement, if nothing else. And then we, of course, start seeing them make smaller moves, investments in schools for equipment grants so they can build out these programs, whole districts reworking their course catalogs. It's been pretty incredible. Now, what I will say is that they're also fascinating from the standpoint of what could the federal election end up impacting for that state. They've been very vocal when it comes to the school choice discussion. We know that they have been a leader in the conversation around school vouchers, for instance. I know that they have gotten an extraordinary number of applications and granted an extraordinary number of vouchers for school choice opportunity in that state, which also speaks to national movements and more diverse choices for school that we're seeing, such as homeschooling. So Ohio is on the map for me right now, and I'm fascinated both from the changes that they could make agnostic of the federal environment, as well as those impacted because of the federal environment.
That's great. Jenny, is there a state that's intriguing you right now?
Yeah, I think one state that's often talked about as a hot button state for education policy and elections would be Florida. Something interesting is that Florida holds its school board elections a few weeks before the general election. So they've held those elections already, but there are several that are going to be going to runoffs in November. And I think it's a really interesting shift. In 2022, most of the candidates backed, school board candidates backed by Governor DeSantis were elected, 25 out of 30. And this time, only about a third of the candidates that DeSantis had endorsed have won their elections. A third didn't, and a third are going into runoffs. So I think those races are going to be very, very close, and they're going to impact the lives of kids very directly. I think sometimes school board elections are overlooked as not being as important. They're not as exciting as statewide or federal races, that sort of thing. But if you think about how it's going to affect your kids, grandkids, and your local community, it's going to have more of a direct impact in some of those larger elections a lot of the time. So I think it will be really interesting to watch some of those close races in Florida. The other reason being that sometimes things that happen in Florida's school board oftentimes trickle around to the rest of the country. So we've seen that even here in Montana, that things happening in Florida end up in our school board rooms here. So I think it'll be really important to pay attention to those very local races in Florida and see how that pans out.
I hear people complain about what their school board is doing. Like I don't want to be that policy professor who's like, you didn't study the candidates before you voted last time, but um uh because I know the answer. The answer is no, I didn't actually bother to see what they wanted to do. And shocker, they decided to ban books. That it really rubs me the wrong way. Well, that's actually what they campaigned on, right? So yeah, but you talk about an immediate local impact on education and education policy. It's definitely those school board elections, which, like you said, Jenny, in some states they're held separately. In other states, they're on election day. In other states, they're in the spring. They're all over the map. But this is something that people should really look into. And then I think your comment's really interesting about how I mean, this is sort of federalism, right? Is that states have primary constitutional responsibility for education, and they're experimenting with different things. Seems like it's starting to work. It is amazing how fast other states start to pick it up and start to seriously discuss it. Could this work here? And sometimes it jumps from state to state, and states where you go, man, those states are as different as they possibly could be. And yet you see this cross fertilization, if you will, Again, yet another reason why really paying close attention to what's happening in different states really matters. I'm going to pick North Carolina. Um, it I should also say we're doing this about 4 days after the storm hit, so all of our thoughts and prayers are with everyone there, especially in that western half of the state. It's a very close election, a lot of attention this presidential cycle for obvious reasons. They're also electing a governor, which you've probably heard about, and they're one of the few states that actually this time around is voting on their entire state house. So all the senators, all of those representatives. Republicans have a super majority now by one person, and that person is someone who switched from being a Democrat to the other party to give them that super majority. So it is, and that's really important because if Governor Cooper or a future Democratic governor vetoes something, a super majority can override it. So that one person makes a huge difference in North Carolina education policy. That said, it's also a state that's done some great bipartisan education work that has involved people working across parties. So it's just the whole politics of it fascinates me. If they lose the supermajority, or if they keep it, or if they get a super majority and there's a bit of an upset and there's a Republican governor, um, uh, who knows what could happen? Or nothing may happen, and they may keep focusing on bipartisan education policy initiatives. One that I'm particularly fond of is called automatic enrollment, um, which is a bit hard to describe because it's so simple. People think they're missing something, but you're not. And essentially, what it is that if you perform at the highest level in the previous school year, you're automatically enrolled in the advanced math class the following year. So if you're a fifth grade student and you do really well in advanced math, you're automatically placed in advanced math for sixth grade. And as obvious as that sounds, people don't realize that's often not how it's done. It's more opting in, and this is opting out. So you're automatically placed there. This was passed almost unanimously in North Carolina in 2019. It passed again a couple years later, where they kind of fixed some pieces of it. And now there's a pretty strong push to expand it beyond math, which I think would be fantastic. And again, they did that almost unanimously. Everyone got got involved. It's been a really big success story. And to Jenny's point before, other states are looking at the North Carolina experience, trying to see if there's ways that they can bring it into their state. So we've talked about Ohio, Florida, North Carolina. We could talk about lots of other states too, but there are certainly issues that we are seeing cut across several different states. And I'm really interested to hear what some issues are that each of you are watching that are kind of percolating in lots of places. Jenny, why don't you share that you may have?
Sure. I think one thing that I've seen start in certain places and then either expand or move to other states would be education savings accounts, or ESAs. I know a lot of states have passed education savings accounts so that students with disabilities receive their per pupil money to be used in other educational ways, for whether that be tuition for a private school or homeschooling or that sort of thing, and then expanded it to other student groups. So I know we've seen that in Florida and Arizona, where it started with one group of students and then the state legislature has expanded it to other groups. And I think that that's going to be something that we'll see in other states, either a new ESA law if they don't have one already, or looking to expand it from maybe a subgroup to the more general population. So that will be interesting to see how successful those bills are. how, if any of them are working their way through the courts, how that pans out, and to see how many states really go forward with that path.
I don't know if you saw, but in Arizona, there have been some stories about the fact that their school choice approach has actually cost the state much more than they anticipated. And Arizona does school funding in very complex, unique ways that we don't have time to get into. It's a really, really interesting case study. And there's been a little bit of pushback since saying, but public schools have never been funded better, et cetera. But it does seem to be factual that they're having to cut other non-education areas of the budget to make up for some of those unanticipated costs. Arizona is a state that's gone much further in that direction for much longer. So it's a state that we can really learn from how to sort of avoid some of these problems.
I
But I
think
think I
it
think that's going to be really really interesting for folks to watch. Sabrina, some issues that cut across that you're seeing in several states and communities.
I have to talk about AI. AI is everywhere, whether a state supports it or an LEA supports it, or if they don't, it is on the agenda. We've seen everything from the classic, I don't know it. I don't understand it. I'm scared of it. We're going to ban it for now, to a full switch over to now we need to develop policies for handling this and dealing with it. The fact of the matter is that it's here and it's very quickly becoming ubiquitous to everyday life. It is infused in our phones. It's infused in everyday tools. You mentioned deep fake at the beginning of this. AI is infusing into everyday life. There was a time when digital literacy really just meant understanding how to get online, how to search the internet, understand fact from otherwise. It's so much more complex than that. And so the conversation both spans, does it belong in the classroom as a tool, all the way through to how are we preparing our youth for this? And so the firm that I'm with, ILO, believes so firmly that AI is going to be a part of the conversation and something that we need to manage and be prepared for in the most pragmatic and thoughtful way, that we're actually starting a new division of our organization. A little bit of a play on words, AILO, that by the time this comes out, we will have announced that that's a new division of our organization. I'm glad you've enjoyed that, the little play on words there. But the idea is that we need to help people deal with wherever their politics lie, with the policies, with the digital literacy, and with the training that needs to come with understanding how to handle this.
Yeah, AI is certainly on my list of things that I'm seeing states tackle. It's obviously important. Um, uh, I'd be interested in both of your thoughts. My sense is that given that even some of the tech people involved with AI don't know what it really means at this point, and or what it's going to mean, expecting state level policymakers or even federal policymakers to have the expertise to figure out how to put privacy protections in place, et cetera. Um, Boy, that feels like Mount Everest to me, to people who don't know how to climb mountains, right? Like it just, I don't know. Any thoughts about that? It's definitely a huge issue. I certainly agree, but I just don't see the capacity. I mean, if Meta, Google, OpenAI can't really predict where this is going to go, how the heck is a state representative who is trying to learn how to use their new iPhone going to figure out AI policy protections? Any thoughts?
I'd love to jump in here. I am, especially having worked in municipal government, I am intimately familiar with what it means to prepare a public serving team for dealing with cybersecurity. It's an extraordinary lift. People, the general person, I should say, doesn't sincerely understand how often there are attacks, if you will, or things that happen with your system, or where there are vulnerabilities that need to be managed. And there are some things that can be mitigated, but the manpower that it takes to maintain that and then handle the when, not if, circumstance, when there is a cybersecurity breach and something happens, it's just a very large reality and has been for a very long time for public serving teams. And schools, public schools in particular, have been the target of a great deal of these sorts of attacks and circumstances. When we invite more technology into our world, you're right. Those instances compound and there's more variables to consider. I do worry about there being enough attention to the sort of capacity that that takes, especially with schools looking at really challenged budgets and relief money running out and cuts needing to happen somewhere. Sometimes the thing that is the just in case gets cut. And it's part of the reason why we're so involved in this work, to have the real conversation and go, again, it's not if, it's when. And so do you have a plan within the reality of the resources that you have?
Jenny, any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I think this is one of those issues where we could really get in a dangerous territory if there's a top-down approach that's not well thought out and well researched and made by people that are well educated on the issue. I think that oftentimes with some of these policy decisions that have to be made in a classroom, local communities have sometimes a better understanding than a statewide official might on how it's going to affect their individual classrooms, students, that sort of thing. So I think the danger could be if we have something coming from the state legislature mandating that schools do something a certain way without it being really well thought out, that it could put just teachers in the classroom in a tough position of trying to sort through this very, very new technology.
This is all. I was really worried when Sabrina brought up AI that we were going to end, but it is actually very constructive insights about like where it's going to have to come from, where the expertise is going to have to come from. It has to be a solvable problem. We can't just give up and turn it over to AI, right? So I do think another positive from my personal perspective is cell phone bans. We're starting to see cell phone bans in free. A little state action, a lot of local action on this. Initial response from everyone seems to be, oh my gosh, it's totally changed in classrooms. And of course it has. Of course it has. We don't have these action devices in front of us. And so I think there's probably and less smart ways to do it. We need to study that carefully. Back to Jenny's point, rather than the top down makes a lot of policy sense to me. I think looking at those cell phone bans. Sabrina, Jenny, any issues that you think people should be paying attention to as we head into November?
Yeah, I think that there's a really interesting tension that's happened over the last few election cycles around intellectual freedom and book banning, right? Versus like a parental rights discussion. I think that we've seen a lot of parental rights legislation come through that has really brought up really interesting conversations around how much involvement parents should have in their child's education, what they can or cannot pull them out of, and what schools' role is in communicating with parents. I think those discussions around intellectual freedom versus book banning are things that happen both at the local level and at state legislatures. So I think that we will continue to see that issue come up.
Sabrina, any other things you're watching?
Science of reading. There is every single time we know that some standardized test scores drop, the conversation is learning loss. And so people have been holding very tight to the science of reading conversation and really trying to look at how we shift some long-term academic success. That is a consistent thing that I do not see going anywhere. In fact, we recently published a playbook in partnership with SUNY New Paltz and an organization called IBIS Group, where we worked with some of the New York ecosystem to say, how could we potentially write down or create a bit of a roadmap for how to set up resource centers to support this work ongoing? Because it's not going anywhere. And the amount of a lift, much in the same way we talked about AI and it taking an extraordinary amount of capacity and it being necessary, we feel the same way about science of reading, that we're at a critical point right now where our learning loss is just going to be a long road for us to address. That whether you believe that it's as a result of the pandemic or, of course, we were struggling with this before. The scary COVID-19 came down the pike, science of reading is here to stay.
Yeah. I would also add, I wouldn't call it the science of math, but I'm starting to see much more state level discussion about math education policy, which for whatever reason doesn't get as much attention as other content areas. And I don't think it'll be next year. The session after that, I have a feeling we're going to see a lot of state action. States really seem to be studying it now. So um, I could talk to the two of you about this for hours and hours, but we're going to wrap it up. I do want to apologize to viewers. My Wi-Fi has been very, very glitchy, so you're going to see lots of little tiny edits. Zoom is awesome. We can do stuff like this anywhere. We are spread across 4 different time zones today. But the downside is some guy always has a bad internet connection, and today I am that guy. So apologies. In closing, I do want to share some thoughts that we often talk about within the ed policy program. First and foremost, you are involved with education policy. If you are watching this, you are involved with education policy. You're either actively involved or you're a victim. And I say that tongue in cheek, but you are impacted by policy and you do have agency in it. And the foundational first step is voting in state and local elections, which is where most of your education policy is created, revised, improved, determined. We're going to include at least one helpful link on the webinar page that can direct you to different sources to find out more information about your candidates. But the information is out there, and especially in state and local races, they'd better have education opinions because they will be doing education policy. With that, I'd like to thank you for watching. I'd like to thank Jenny, Sabrina for sharing all their insights, and thank our many Hopkins colleagues who worked to put this session of Hopkins at Home together. Thank you.